Good morning and welcome to Sustainable Silicon Valley's first Wet Talk of 2024, Lucky Wet Talk 13 with Jeffrey Kightlinger. Just very little about Sustainable Silicon Valley. As it says here, we are an active think tank focused around water use and reuse, air quality, mobility, and equitable regenerative communities. And we have different programs in water, air, and mobility as well. We want to remind that Wet Talk 13 is sponsored by Cargill and the nice people in the land use department. They were part of a Wet Talk recently with what they call the mixed sea salts processing and brine discharge pipeline. It's about a 20-mile pipeline that's going through the East Bay that they are funding basically to remove what they call the mixed sea salts from their salt fields in the bay. And that's something they're doing in conjunction with the Oraloma Sanitary District and the other joint associations that it's a real responsible investment in the Bay as well. So about Jeffrey Kightlinger, he is best known as the Chief Executive Officer of the Metropolitan Water District of Southern California. He did that for 15 years. He's the longest tenured executive of the over 100-year institution. The Metropolitan is the largest municipal water provider in the nation. It averages 2 billion gallons of water a day and delivering to 19 million residents in Southern California. So that's a significant portion of Southern California, or of California overall, and almost half of California. And that's across the counties of Los Angeles, Orange, Riverside, San Bernardino, San Diego, and Ventura. So it has a multi-billion, 1.8 billion annual budget and over 1,800 employees, and has led on a number of different agreements and projects in over that time, the last 15 years. So prior to becoming CEO, Mr. Kightlinger was, here's the thing, was the chief legal officer and is known as an expert on water law and the law of the river, specifically the Colorado River. He also now is a Cal Water Service Group board member and was interim general manager for Pasadena Water and Power. He had his start in the Bay Area, a history undergrad at UC Berkeley, and then went on to Santa Clara School of Law. I did just want to mention, and up in the right-hand corner here is the website, mwdh2o.com. You may want to take a look at that. That's the Metropolitan Water website, and it is quite a website full of all kinds of information. And this part of the website is actually something that the State Water Project, Colorado River Aqueduct, and MWD distribution are things that will get discussed, as well as a very interesting pure water Southern California demonstration project that could potentially become the largest water purification project in the country, as much as 150 million gallons a day, which is a crazy number. So I will turn it over to Jeff Kightlinger, and we'll actually get rid of this share, and I will tiptoe away. Take it away.
Thank you, Dennis. Appreciate the chance to be here, and thanks, Sustainable Silicon Valley. And I'm going to give you some background on Metropolitan, some of the history of the agency, give you a sense of the size and scope and the infrastructure involved, and then talk about the current water policy issues facing Metropolitan and, by and large, California in the West. So let me go back to the beginning of Metropolitan. Metropolitan was Los Angeles-based organization that started out in Los Angeles, and it really came from, as Los Angeles was beginning to grow at the turn of the century. William Mulholland was the head of the Los Angeles Department of Water and Power, and he famously went out and acquired and built the Los Angeles Aqueduct up to the Owens Valley. And it's very similar to, and same sort of time frame as the Hetch Hetchy system in San Francisco. Both of them tap into waters east and are gravity flow systems, which is the type of systems they could build in the turn of the century, 1900s. And the Owens Valley supply brings water a couple hundred miles out of the Owens Valley to the city of Los Angeles. And it came online in 1913. And William Mulholland at that time thought they'd supplied 50 years of supply to Los Angeles, and that they were well ahead of all the growth. But there was a huge boom that started in Los Angeles starting around the mid-1900s, which was based on oil, and then the beginning of the film industry. And as early as the early 1920s, it became clear to Mulholland that more water was going to be needed other than just the Owens Valley supply. And he began looking around, and with the technology they had at the time, the closest, biggest supply of water they could find was the Colorado River. And that's roughly about 250 miles east of Southern California. And Mulholland went into his city attorney's office and said, I'm going to need about $220 million to go build an aqueduct to the Colorado River. And the attorney looked at the bonding capacity of the city of LA at the time and determined that even though it's the large city in Southern California, that they couldn't bond it. There wasn't enough capacity and property value to issue bonds to build it. And the city attorney came up with an idea, and that was, why don't we bring in the suburb cities? If we bring in the suburb cities and form a coalition, we can afford it. And it makes more sense because Los Angeles, with its Owens Valley supply, Mulholland was looking 20 years ahead, didn't really need Colorado River water at that time in the 1920s. And so it took a few years of work, but they went to the California legislature and they created the Metropolitan Water District of Southern California. And it's a coalition of the 13 cities in Southern California. At its time, it was Los Angeles, Long Beach, Santa Monica, Beverly Hills, Glendale, Burbank, Pasadena, a couple cities in Orange County. And they bonded together to pool their costs to build the Colorado River Aqueduct. And there was quite a bit of logistical governmental work that had to take place. First, the California legislature had to create Metropolitan. They had to, though, go to the other states and divide the waters in the Colorado River. That took about almost a decade of wrangling, negotiating the divide between them, overseen by Herbert Hoover. And then you had to go to Congress and get permission to build a dam on the Colorado River, now we known as Hoover Dam, at the time the Boulder Canyon Dam. And then you also had to go to Congress and build another dam, Parker, and go to Congress and get the permits to build the Colorado River Aqueduct. So all that took about 10 years of working in the state legislature, the federal legislature, getting all the land, putting it all together. And then when they went together to finally go finance it in the early 1930s, all this work took place in the 20s. We were in the middle of the Great Depression. And when you think about it, Southern California had about a 40% unemployment rate. It was going to take about 10 years to build this project. It was going to be the most expensive project that had ever been built in the United States at the time, in the world. And it was also going to be financed entirely by debt issuance in Southern California, because the state and federal government said, we're broke, it's the Depression. And so basically, they were asking people to put a property tax lien on themselves for 10 years before there was a drop of water to sell in the middle of the Great Depression with 40% unemployment. And it was going to be a 17% of the entire value of Southern California pledged to a single project. So they foresaw it as a really tough lift, and they put out a lot of propaganda about thirst and growth and living in a desert. And it actually passed overwhelmingly. It was about a 12-1 margin that people voted for it, which I always think of as quite remarkable. It shows you the spirit of people, that they knew things were going to get better, and they were confident that the United States was going to come through the Great Depression and thrive. And by 1940, the project was delivering water. The Colorado River project was built, and Southern California, but about the time not shortly after it came on, there was a huge post-World War II boom, and Southern California started growing remarkably. And we had all the growth. The Colorado River water was fully subscribed. The aqueduct was delivering water to Southern California, and you had all this growth, and parts of Southern California started to join Metropolitan and annex to it. And so as it slowly but surely grew to be the entire Southern California, what we call the urban coastal plain. It's all of Los Angeles, all of Orange County, all of San Diego County, the southern part of Ventura County, and then the eastern parts of Riverside and San Bernardino, where the population centers are in those counties. And it's really kind of where it's ringed by the mountains, the coastal mountains, and it's that whole coastal plain where the people are. In terms of land mass, it's about 1/20th of the state of California. But in terms of population, it's 1 in every 2 Californians live in that area that Metropolitan serves water to. Roughly 19 million people out of California's roughly 38 million people live in the Metropolitan service area. So I like to think of it as 1 of every 2 Californians, or another way is 1 in every 16 Americans lives in Southern California and is served water by Metropolitan. So as we started to grow in the 1940s with the post-war boom, again, we were pretty confident that we had taken care of the next 50 years with Colorado River water. But again, already by the early 1950s, as we had infill and we started ripping out all the orange trees and citrus that that was Orange County and replacing it with homes, it became clear that another source of water was going to be needed. And that eventually, Metropolitan, after much internal debate, and it was interesting, there was a Orange County, San Diego, Inland Empire area. All that area was predominantly agriculture, but growing into homes and suburbs. Los Angeles represented the old guard. And Los Angeles said, we don't really want to grow more. We're satisfied with where our water supply, because they're reaching close to being built out. And they already had paid for much of the Colorado River and their own Owens Valley aqueducts. But the growing areas in the southern part of Southern California, Orange, San Diego County, they pushed and clamored for a new water supply. Well, after much debate and wrangling with the state of California and the governor at the time, Pat Brown, Metropolitan, over Los Angeles protests, eventually decided to bankroll the State Water Project. Now, the State Water Project was Pat Brown's plan to move water from the northern Sierras to the Central Valley for farming and to Southern California. And to make it work, he knew he needed metropolitan support. And Pat Brown did a lot of twisting arms in Los Angeles and eventually got the Metropolitan Board. After 4 failed votes, Metropolitan voted to go ahead and finance the State Water Project. And it was a remarkable commitment. And you can understand why at the time a lot of the civic leaders were a little skeptical of it. It was, again, going to be the most expensive civil works project ever built in the world. It was pretty massive. It's going to be some 300 miles of aqueducts and canals, dams in Northern California, the largest pump station ever built to lift the water over the Tehachapi Mountains over into Southern California. And it was really going to stress all our technical and technology and engineering capacities at the time. It was going to be incredibly cutting edge and very expensive. And it was a rather breathtaking commitment. What the contract that was called for was that Metropolitan would pay half the cost of the State Water Project as a fixed cost debt for 75 years. So the contract signed in 1960 runs through 2035. And it's what we call in our industry a take or pay contract, which I never quite understood the or, because you pay regardless. It's really and you pay, and you get whatever the project serves. So some years the project serves up a lot of water because there's a lot of rain and snow, and you get a lot of water for your money. In some years, in a drought year, the project serves up hardly any water, and it doesn't really matter. You pay half the cost. And when people think about what costs are for water, we don't really pay for water. What we pay for is infrastructure. And the marginal cost of moving water, which is really the electricity, the power to move it, is fairly small. So the cost of the State Water Project is pretty static. It's basically, it costs the same in a drought year minus the electricity as it costs in a really wet year. So regardless of how much water you get, your bill is pretty much the same. And to give you a sense of what the size of the bill is, Metropolitan now will be paying in a year like this it's getting close to about $560 million a year. So it's over $500 million a year as a single check to the state of California to finance half the cost of the State Water Project. And for that, Metropolitan gets half the water the project delivers. Now, the project was originally designed to deliver 4 million acre-feet per year. On average, though, the project was originally intended to have several more dams. It dams up the water right now on the Feather River at Lake Oroville. And then the water that's captured there gets released down the Feather River, goes to the Sacramento River. It makes its way through the San Francisco Bay Delta. And then at the southern end of the Delta, the pumping plants lift the water into that California aqueduct that parallels Highway 5 and brings the water all the way through the Central Valley, delivers to the farms there, and then to Southern California. The project was supposed to include dams on the Eel River and elsewhere to provide more water, but those were never built. They ran out of money. The project was also supposed to include a bypass canal system that went around the Delta. And we'll get more into that later. Again, it was never built because the project ran out of money. But still, when you look at the sheer scope and size of it, it's pretty amazing. And as Dennis has here on the map, one of the remarkable things, you can think about it, in California, we can take a water from the very northern part of the state, even north of Lake Oroville, up in Lake Shasta, where we have a dam there. That's a federal project dam that delivers water primarily to the San Joaquin Valley and Sacramento valleys. But you can take a drop of water there and deliver it to Chula Vista on the Mexico border through our plumbing system. A lot of environmental impacts associated with that, a lot of energy associated with that. but it is a marvel of the world. And most people in most parts of the world that run a water system are pretty jealous that we have managed to build a system that can support this. Absent this kind of plumbing and hardware system like this, you don't have a Southern California of 38 million people and the fifth largest economy in the world. It's just, that would simply not be possible absent the kind of infrastructure that we built to support it. Well, Metropolitan brings online with the state of California the State Water Project, and after the vote taken in 1960, and it was a vote that went to the voters for statewide bonds, and it barely passes. Pat Brown does a barnstorming effort, and Southern California votes are enough. There is opposition in Northern California, but it's not incredibly strident opposition, but it barely passes. 51-49 vote statewide. State Water Project gets built, and it begins delivering water a decade later in 1971. And that becomes really the last huge major water system built in the state of California. That takes us to about 1990. And in 1990, Metropolitan suffered its first real serious drought, where for the first time ever, Metropolitan had to ration water. And we've had serious droughts in the state before. If people remember in the late 70s, 1977, when Governor Jerry Brown was governor the first time, we had an incredibly bad drought. In fact, it was hydrologically considered one of the worst droughts ever in about 2,000 years of tree ring history. That drought was incredibly severe, and people might recall Marin County basically ran out of water, and they had to strap a pipe across the Dunbarton Bridge and bring water into Marin County just by piping it over because they ran out of water. The source of the water that went to Marin was Metropolitan. What Metropolitan did was they ramped up pumping on the Colorado River, and they, at the request of Jerry Brown, they forsook a lot of their state water project water, their Northern California water supplies, gave that back to the state, and the state supplied it to Marin County and bailed them out of the drought. And Metropolitan could do that because it had this diverse mix of supplies. It has its nice groundwater basins, it has local supplies, and it had the Colorado River aqueduct. So we pumped up heavily using some Nevada and Arizona water and ran our aqueduct, the Colorado River aqueduct, at about 110% of capacity to get through the 70s drought with no real impact to Metropolitan and an ability to help out other parts of the state. But by 1990, that didn't happen. Northern California went into another drought in 1990, and Metropolitan, for the first time, had to ration water. And with kind of hindsight, you can kind of see what happened. 1900, Southern California ran out of water and built the Owens Valley Aqueduct. 1930, we ran out of water and built the Colorado River Aqueduct. 1960, we started to run out of water and built the State Water Project. And then 1990, we ran out of water and had to ration. And the answer had always been, just go tap into another supply. The difference was it was a very different world in 1990 than it had been in 1960 and 1930 and 1900. Those engineering solutions were harder, more expensive, but politically, the world had changed. We passed a slew of environmental laws in the 1970s. We passed in California, the California Environmental Quality Act, the National Environmental Policy Act at the federal level, the Endangered Species Act, and those kind of massive infrastructure replumbing of the West projects had become more or less a thing of the past by the 1990s. That didn't mean our engineers didn't have ideas. We had looked at how to reroute the Klamath River. We'd looked at rerouting the Columbia River and moving it down the Rockies with the help of several nuclear power pumping plants. We'd had looked at actually relocating water from the Mississippi, the Missouri, and the Great Lakes. But that era of massive infrastructure rerouting and replumbing more or less had ended. And so Metropolitan had to kind of rethink how we're going to continue to grow and how we were going to continue to manage that growth and supply enough water. And some of the things that Metropolitan did in the 1990s were pretty unique, but they're now pretty much universal in how we manage water. So Metropolitan did its first ever integrated resource plan. And in the beginning, what we were was the supplemental water provider to the cities of Southern California. But now what we said was we're going to be the water planning agency for all of Southern California. We're not just going to pick up water from far away and sell it to you and be done with our job. We're actually going to look for how do we plan as a region. And there was a fair amount of discussion at the time. Is that really an appropriate governmental role for Metropolitan? Were cities giving up power to Metropolitan to do that? And it took about 4 years of debate before it was decided this was a path we were going to do. And Metropolitan it did its first IRP, Integrated Resource Plan, in the mid-1990s. And we've been updating it every 5 years since. And the idea is we look 25 years ahead and then update it every 5 years and see how we're doing. And what we do is we take into account demand and growth projections and population and then we look at water conditions and water supply. We also look at what does each city have, not just what Metropolitan's going to get from the Colorado River or Northern California, but what's the local supply? What does the groundwater conditions look like? What is rainfall in Southern California? How best can we utilize that? What recycled water opportunities are there? And then Metropolitan also would collect money. And for the first time ever, we started assessing what we called a water stewardship fee. But the really idea was that it was really a public benefit charge. So on every acre foot of water Metropolitan would sell, we'd add on a fee to that. And that fee would be used for conservation, to fund conservation and water recycling and other types of local projects. And prior to that, we had conservation efforts throughout Southern California, but every city did it themselves. So Los Angeles might give you a rebate on a toilet to be a low flush toilet, and Orange County might not. And San Diego might offer a different rebate. And it was all scattered and all ad hoc throughout all of Southern California. Within Southern California, it's not like people have heard of, the big cities, but in metropolitan service area, there's almost 300 cities, ranging from large ones like Los Angeles and San Diego to very little ones, Chula Vista or La Cañada, some down to about 20,000 residents. And every single one would set its own water conservation. What Metropolitan set out to do was basically make that uniform throughout all of Southern California, collect the money in one place, and then redistribute it back in the form of rebates. So if you walked into a Home Depot or a Lowe's, and it didn't matter what city in Southern California, they would offer the same rebates on toilets. And it made conservation much more effective, much more uniform, and much stronger throughout all of Southern California. And so that effort took a lot of planning and as you can imagine, a lot of institutionalized work to really kind of institutionalize this, that Metropolitan's role would shift from just being a imported water provider to actually the water, basically the whole water manager for Southern California. And that's led us to kind of the present day. And it's been remarkably effective in its own way. In 1990, Southern California had 14 million people, and Metropolitan sold 2.4 million acre feet. And for folks not familiar with acre foot, that's how we measure water in our business. An acre foot is about 326,000 gallons. It's an acre. It's really an agricultural measurement. It's an acre of land 1 foot deep in water. We estimate an acre foot now serves about 3 normal households for a year for their water supply. So we would sell in 1990, 2.4 million acre feet to satisfy demands for 12 million people. Today, Metropolitan serves 19 million people, and we're selling about 1.6 million acre feet. So we've actually cut the amount of water by a third. At the same time, we've grown in terms of population 25, 30%. So we've been able to add a lot of people and actually reduce the amount of water. And that's been critical to getting through this. Otherwise, we would have had to build some fourth aqueduct to some faraway place to get that water. And instead, we've been able to do that with demand management, conservation, and the funding of recycled water projects throughout Southern California. That gets me to kind of the last topic I really wanted to stress. So, this model that we have in Southern California of a regional water provider, and what's the stresses on it are now. We've managed to do well in terms of managing growth and population, but right now we're trying to manage through what climate change is happening and doing to our system. The good news for Metropolitan has always been, we've been always very strong dealing with droughts because of the diversity of supply. Metropolitan gets about half its water locally, which is rainfall, which feeds the Los Angeles River, and that local rainfall, even though it's less than you get in Northern California, 12, 14 inches of rain in LA area, 6, 7 inches in San Diego. That rainfall feeds some pretty big groundwater basins in Orange County, the San Gabriel Valley, the San Fernando Valley. And these groundwater basins can provide a significant amount of water. Almost 35, 40% of all of Southern California's water comes from that groundwater. The other big sources, the Colorado River, that comes from the Rockies to the north and east of us here. And then the State Water Project comes from the Sierra Mountains. So you have 3 hydrologically distinct watersheds that provide Metropolitan's water supply. And when the Colorado River, when the Rockies would go in drought, or when the Sierras would go in drought, they weren't regional. The drought would be, you'd still have water in usually 2 out of the 3. So that diversity of supply really helped protect Metropolitan against drought. But by the 1990s, we found that wasn't enough with our population. So Metropolitan began doing 2 big things in the 90s. First was the conservation effort, and second was building storage. One of the lessons we kind of started to learn was that our hydrology was becoming even more volatile. And that's one of the impacts that we started tracking of climate change starting in the early 2000s and what we've seen over the last quarter century. California, people may not realize this, but California has by far and away the most variable hydrology in the United States. In the Southwest, it's mostly dry. In the North and Northeast, it's more or less wet. But their hydrology falls within a pretty narrow range. Our hydrology ranges from extremely wet to extremely dry in California, and our range is far greater than anywhere in the nation. And that's good in many respects. We have the most diverse kind of biodiversity and our natural systems in here in California because of that high variability. But as a utility manager, we're trying to deliver water 24/7, 365. We like nice and steady. That makes it easy to plan, but we don't have that. Climate change has even exacerbated that even more. So we started looking at how do you manage that high variability? And one of the things you do in the water business is build storage. Metropolitan in the 1990 could only store about 250,000 acre feet, or 1/10 of our whole demand could be in reservoirs at any time. By the time I left GM in 2021, Metropolitan could store up to 5 million acre feet, 2 full years of demand all the time in reservoirs and groundwater basins. And about half of that storage is above ground in reservoirs and about half of it in groundwater basins. And this was a huge, expensive effort by Metropolitan from the 1990s. We spent over $2 billion building a Diamond Valley Lake Reservoir, which is out by Lake Heaven, the largest reservoir in Southern California. We spent another $1 billion in groundwater basins, wells and spreading basins and system. Another $1 billion in our inland feeder pipeline to go feed them all. So rebuilding a huge storage network across Southern California was roughly about a $4 billion effort over 25 years from the mid-1990s to the 2020. And that has really helped harden and make our area a lot more resilient for drought. And the reason you can see that is you look at the years now that we've had in California. While I was GM in 2005 to 2020, we had two of the stretches of the driest ever period of weather in California ever in recorded history. And you have to go back 1,800 years based on tree rings to find anything of comparable drought to what we had in the 2012, 2015 period. We had another extreme drought. We've had three, in the last 15 years, we've had three governors declare statewide drought emergencies. 8 of the last 15 years have been drought emergency years. And we haven't had real dramatic rationing. We haven't had the shock effects like Australia had when they had similar conditions. And part of that is we've been preparing for this. When we have these wet years, which we still have in California, Metropolitan has built the system to capture all that water and move it into reservoirs, move it into groundwater basins pretty rapidly. So even having gone through this last 15-year period with about half of those years being drought, we still move into the next decade with more water and storage in our history, Metropolitan's history, than they've ever had before. And that's because we have these occasional wet years where we can move all that water. So that has worked well toward preparing us to deal with a climate change world. But still, here's the significant challenges we see coming. If you go to the Colorado River has lost, by most projections, about 30% of its supply, of its historic supply to climate change. Shrinking snowpack, early spring, hotter weather, all those things have resulted in less and less water reaching the Colorado River. To the point where the states are now using more water than is coming in. And we've been living off our stored water in Lake Mead and Lake Powell for the last 15 years. And obviously that's not sustainable. Now, the guidelines that govern the river, and we negotiate those and adapt those every couple of decades. The last time we did it was 2007. The current guidelines expire in 2026. And most people agree, most experts agree, to be sustainable, we're going to have to reduce the consumption on the Colorado River by 1.5 million acre feet every single year. That'll have to be shared with the lower basin region of the states of Arizona, Nevada, and California, and the country of Mexico. So that's a huge reduction. When we talk about 1.5 million acre feet, that's almost all of Southern California's water supply for 19 million people. That's the amount we're going to have to somehow find a way to reduce the usage in those three states, Arizona, California, Nevada, and Mexico. So you can imagine that's an incredible, politically tough, fraught negotiation. But we also know it has to happen because the current situation cannot be sustained. And the federal government has said you have to get this done by 2026, or the Secretary of Interior will do it for you. And the last thing we all want to do is have a dictate of how to share it. So we want to try and solve this ourselves. We've been in state-to-state negotiations. We're talking with the tribes. We're talking with environmental groups, talking with the sovereign country of Mexico. So you can imagine this is a really tough, long, protracted geopolitical negotiation taking place. But we have to be successful at it. We're on a good path. We have a good track record of negotiating these issues out amongst the states in recent years. In past years, legal historians are well aware of the Supreme Court challenges and battles between Arizona and California of the 1960s, and we don't want to go back before the U.S. Supreme Court in state-to-state battles. Our goal as water managers is to solve this, but it will be the toughest negotiation we've ever had, and we are right in the middle of it. Our goal is to come up with at least a lower basin agreement, a framework agreement between Arizona, California, and Nevada by March. So 6 weeks, 8 weeks from now. We've been working on it for a couple of years. Our goal is to wrap this up in the next 8 weeks, and we still have a long ways to go. But I am hopeful and fingers crossed optimistic we're going to get there. Moving to Northern California, we haven't seen the same reduction in water supply that we've seen year in, year out, that we've seen on the Colorado River. We've seen that 30% lost on the Rockies. We haven't seen that same thing in the Sierras, which is good news. But what we have seen in the Sierras is much more diminished snowpack and much more volatility. And that's what we're seeing, climate whiplash, and that we're getting from the climate change. And so we're seeing more volatility, which puts a lot of stress on our infrastructure. We get these wet years, and our levee system that's in the Bay Delta and protecting Sacramento is stressed by these big atmospheric rivers that are coming through. And we're seeing a diminished snowpack. We still get a lot of water, but it's coming in as rain more often than snow. We've had 130, 140 years of recorded history in California. And of the 10 worst snowpacks we've ever seen, 7 have been in the last 15 years. So climate change, shrinking our snowpack. And why that's really important is we built our system to rely on slow melting snow that takes 4 or 5 months to melt from the Sierras that we can capture and move around the state. Now, if that same precipitation is coming in, but instead of having 4 or 5 months to manage it, we only have 14, 15 days to manage it in storms, our systems weren't designed for that. Well, we've been talking about how to build more robust systems to capture and move water when it's coming in as rain. The most recent idea of the last decade has been build some tunnels under the Delta and move water into the state project system. That has been incredibly contentious in Northern California. A lot of opposition to it. Governor Newsom, Governor Brown, Governor Schwarzenegger started the concept. Governor Brown had a 2-tunnel proposal. Governor Newsom shrunk it to a 1-tunnel proposal. It's still on the proposal stage. It's being worked through. The environmental review documents have just recently been completed on a single tunnel, but still incredible political opposition to it. A lot of financing challenges to it. It's not going to be a cheap project. It's going to be 15, 20 billion, maybe more. So you're going to have to figure out how we're going to pay for it, how we get enough political support to do it. Water has always been a challenge politically. There's always been a north-south divide here about how to manage water. But as a state, if we're going to be reliable and deal with 38, 40 million people, we got to find some way to resolve these issues and move forward. Even when we did it in 1960 with the State Water Project, it was by a 1% vote. So it hasn't gotten any easier over the last 50, 60 years. The last thing, though, I want to point out, and what I think is a real hopeful sign, is Metropolitan is also looking at building, and this started about 5 years ago when I was GM. I started the analysis for building what we call a pure water, SoCal Pure Water Project. The idea would be the largest water recycling facility in Southern California, and in the nation, 150 million gallons a day facility. And the idea of building it would be to basically then take all the water replenishment for all the groundwater basins, the major groundwater basins in Southern California, and moving it to recycled water and saving our imported water for drought management and climate change issues. That's going to be an incredibly expensive project, a multi-billion-dollar facility. And it also is going to supply a lot of water that we don't necessarily need at this point in time. 30, 40 years from now, perhaps. But if we don't start it now, it's hard to get it done 30, 40 years from now. One of the far-reaching and ideas that we had was that we would cost share this with Nevada and Arizona. They would pay up to 25% or so of the project. 25% of the water would be returned to them by exchange of Metropolitan's Colorado River supplies. It's a way of artificially augmenting the flow on the Colorado River to make up for some of that lost water. And it's a way of partnering among the big urban centers of Las Vegas, Los Angeles, and Phoenix, and finding a way in which those urban entities can find ways to cost share, grow recycled water, and collectively lessen our demand on a stressed resource, the Colorado River. So a lot of far-reaching ideas there, and a lot of interstate cooperation amongst red and blue states. And I really find that to be politically and technologically a very promising path. And it's obviously got a lot of hurdles to go through, but it's in the environmental review stage, and we're working through it. So I see a lot of opportunity there for the future and how we can think through these issues collectively as a state, but even broader as the entire Southwest region. So I'm going to wrap it up there. That's kind of the history of Metropolitan and some of the water challenges we have today. And happy to take any questions, Dennis.
Yes, well, keeping on the pure water, I mean, I'm still, I was telling you even before the webinar about the 150 million gallon a day figure is, you know, just mind blowing compared. Valley Water has, well, I think Orange County is 35 million gallons a day, and that's the biggest in the country. Valley Water in Alviso has operating, that's 8 MGD, and they're talking about a new pure water treatment that'd be 12 million gallons a day, as is Silicon Valley Clean Water and SFPUC. They're looking to do a 12 million gallon a day facility in the further north on the peninsula, with San Mateo as well. So those are numbers, 8, 12, 12 versus 150. So it's the scale of it is pretty, would be pretty mind blowing as well. And then of course, right now at least, there is about, for every 8 million gallons, say, that Valley Water does, they create 1 million gallons of brine.
Yeah.
And no one has quite figured out the best ways to deal with brine. There's been a lot of nice nature-based solution kind of things within the bay itself. Horizontal levees primarily would be the big one. There is in Southern California, there's more use of the ocean and dilution there. Kind of problematic, but I mean, that's kind of what's getting used. And I hope that Sustainable Silicon Valley we are working on a project called Breaking Brine. I guess has a TV show tie-in, but we're trying to do something novel in that particular area. But it's certainly a big deal. So 150 million gallons a day. I mean, you're talking about how many millions of gallons a day of brine? I mean, another 20 million gallons.
Yeah, there are no free rides in our business. Everything has, and recycled water is deemed a very environmentally friendly project compared to maybe, say, imported water, but it has impacts. And the big impacts are energy. It's energy intensive. And the other one is brine. There is a brine byproduct once you've recycled water. And the solution mostly has been to use what we call brine outfalls. And these outfalls just put that brine, the concentrated brine, in the ocean. It's cleaned up, contaminants are removed from it, so it's just purely salted compound. But yet we use the ocean for disposal of that brine. And absent that, it's really hard to recycle water. So you don't see as much. So typically, where you see the recycled water is on the coast, where you can have access to the ocean. You don't see a lot of recycled water in the Phoenix, Denver, Las Vegas area because they don't really have an easy spot to deal with brine. When you put it on land, you end up with these brine sumps that eventually become more and more toxic over time. So yeah, that's what we've used as the ocean in Southern California. But it does have that trade-off and no doubt impacts.
So they're just in the Q&A there. There's more coming up about the thing. So in the Q&A, there was a question about the cost to deliver water. You mentioned the $500 million, which was the state water project 50-50 kind of split. So, but the question was, is the cost to deliver water $500 million primarily related to the energy carrier such as electricity? So really, I see this as a question about cost components of water supply.
Yeah, that no, it's not. About 85% of that cost is fixed. That's the cost of the dam, the Oroville Dam, and the maintenance, and all the aqueduct systems and the pumping plants. It's for infrastructure. 85% of that $500 million, or the overall $1 billion to maintain the state water project, 85% of that is just for the fixed costs of building and maintaining and paying off the infrastructure, the hardware. About 15% is what we call the marginal cost to move the water. And then that's the electricity. Most of that's electricity, and then some labor and other costs. But yeah, most of that's electricity. But that's 10, 12% of the overall cost. The bulk of the cost is the infrastructure. And that's, people always say, I'm paying for water, but it rains. It should be free. And I go, yeah, you just got to move it. And that's the expensive part.
While we've been talking about water, or you've been talking about water supply, I actually wanted to ask about water quality, or the qualities of water. Now, there's a big difference, just even in Northern California, between water that was basically in the bathtub of Hetch Hetchy, with the granite, and the lack of sedimentation, and how clean that is, how low the pH is, and versus groundwater, which would have more higher pH, higher total dissolved solids and everything. How would you characterize, say, the water within the metropolitan system, and how is it different in different areas? And just wondered about that.
Yeah, no, that's a really good question, and sort of often overlooked, the water quality aspects of it.
We did, by the way, at our Water Palooza, we actually had something. We had a water tasting. Straight reverse osmosis, for instance, versus things, even versus commercially produced seltzer. But anyway, sorry, go ahead.
No, so Metropolitan has, we look at our source water. We always look at, the source water, and we test it incredibly rigorously. Metropolitan has one of the largest labs in the world. And we test roughly about 1,000 different samples daily. 350 some thousand samples a year are taken of water at different locations and measured. And they're different. And so Metropolitan has developed a very careful blending policies and managing policies for water. So if you look at Metropolitan's Colorado River water, it's very salty compared to, say, the Northern California water. The Colorado River water comes in at roughly 500 parts per million total dissolved solids. That's the salts. And a lot of that is because of upstream farming that's occurred. San Francisco, incredibly lucky with its Hetch Hetchy supply, is there is no use for it, use of the water upstream. It's captured at the source at Hetch Hetchy, coming off the granite, and then moves straight there for drinking. And there almost nothing needs to be done, just a little filtering, and it's perfectly good for drinking. Colorado River water has been farmed and used on and come back into the river multiple times over its journey down the Colorado River and eventually to Metropolitan. And that results in a pretty heavy dose of salt that's in that. What Metropolitan has historically done is then blended that water with its state water project supplies. That is coming off the Sierras and has much less impact. It's coming in at less than half the amount of salts of the Colorado River, at less than 200 parts per million. And so a blend of those two helps quite a bit in managing salts and total dissolved solids. Then you have the issue of contaminants. We also look at not just the salt and dissolved solids and mineral compounds of the water, but also, man-made contaminants. Luckily, we've seen those less in the surface water, but big parts of our area are, I talked about this earlier, rely on their groundwater basins. And over time, we have, a lot of industrial development from the 1950s, 60s, and 70s throughout Southern California that resulted in Superfund sites and contaminants such as perchlorate and all sorts of MTBE and all sorts of contamination throughout groundwater basins that have to then be treated, and a lot of expense added as we have to add wellhead treatment to strip out those contaminants. And we've lost a lot of that supply as well, just because we don't have the ability to treat it up to drinking water standards. So we look at the contamination levels, both man-made, the salt issues. We balance and try to blend our water and manage that so it's all good drinking water. One of the things we did at Metropolitan was made a decision around 2000 to shift from our treatment process, which had been by and large at the time to go to ozone treatment instead of chlorination. And we have that's much safer. It's better health-wise. It doesn't, there are some known carcinogen precursors in using all the chlorination and disinfection byproducts from that. And ozonation, and it results in a much better tasting product. And we have a panel of tasting experts that taste the water coming out of our treatment plants that go to all the people. And these are people that are really good at tasting the differences in water. I don't have a good enough palate. I can barely tell the difference in wine, let alone the difference in different types of water. But it's amazing to me to listen to those people talk about there's a mustiness to this or not. Source of water. And it's a real source of pride that we take, and that our tap water is not only going to be perfectly healthy and safe, but also taste good as well. And that shift to ozonation, that was very expensive. Metropolitan operates 5 of the largest treatment plants in the world to deliver treated water throughout Southern California, and shifting them from chlorination to ozonation as their primary source of treatment cost about $1 billion and took us about 20 years to do, but it's resulted in a much healthier and safer product for the public.
Yeah, well, that's great to hear about water quality. I mean, I still find very puzzled faces with water engineers when I start talking about the quality issues of water taste, which is why we had that kind of water tasting to focus the minds and palates on what it actually tastes like, and especially as we get into more of the stuff through reverse osmosis. There's a couple other questions that came up. I'm saving what might be the the best for last. But I do want to, Grant Hogue has a question about, are there studies identifying the value of year-to-year water reliability in Southern California, especially for industry versus residential, urban versus agriculture?
We haven't really broken it out that way. And we really kind of treated everything together. In the early days of Metropolitan, there was a much greater difference between we were it was basically you had all the orange trees of Orange County, and you had quite a bit of agriculture in Southern California, avocados and citrus and grains and all that, dairy. Most of that's gone away as Southern California has urbanized. There's only about 10% of the water now in metropolitan service areas used for agriculture. And
Really?
the heavy,
Wow.
yeah, it's very small now. And the heavy industry base that used to be in Southern California, aerospace and cars and tires, and most of the heavy manufacturing has left as well. The industry now is, software and biotech and movies and entertainment that don't have the same kind of water footprint. And so we basically just sort of treat everything, residential, commercial, retail, and just sort of lump it all together and do that planning for Southern California as a region, not by industrial or commercial sector, because we just haven't seen the differences that there used to be 20, 30 years ago. We do have those projections, and we do plan for drought, and we have all that kind of thinking in our what we called our IRP, the Integrated Resources Plan, that we update every 5 years. What's been a challenge in the water industry has been really dealing with low growth, and the demand has fallen much faster than our modeling and our thinking and our best planning and our best experts predicted, which is good news for us dealing with climate change and more volatile water supply and drought. But it's been a financial challenge and an operational challenge when we've had really fast drop in water supply demands. And we haven't, as an industry, predicted this. It really has caught us somewhat off guard, how dramatic the public has shrunk its water demand. It's a good news story, but it has lots of unintended consequences, many of them financial, and how we manage through it.
In the utility industry, there's always been energy utility has been decoupling, because it takes away the, in a way, divergent incentives for just costing, selling more, say, energy or water versus, but also recognizing the value of efficiency and conservation. And just wondered if you had any thoughts about, say, decoupling within the water world.
So the energy industry has talked about decoupling, and there's some truth in it, and there's some not so, that I think is a bit of a myth. I mean, all you have to do is pull out your electrical bill and your water bill and compare the two. And your electrical bill has gone up at 4 times the rate of your water bill, and is in almost all regions, and where in the urban sector is usually 2 to 3 times higher than your water bill. And that in many places includes your water and sewer combined bill. And so why is that? Well, electricity is expensive. And so you may not be paying exactly based on your usage, but you're still paying for it. The electrical industry, what they've called decoupling, is really shift to very high fixed cost charges. And so what you're paying every month isn't so much based on how much you use, but it's a fixed cost that you're paying every single month, and that is building and funding the electrical system. So whether you pay for it on use or you pay for it in a fixed charge, you're paying for it. And you're paying for it at a much higher rate than you're paying for your water. which hasn't truly as well established fixed charges. So in the electrical industry rate, your fixed charge versus your variable usage rate is much more than half. In some places, 75% or more of it's a fixed charge, regardless of how much you use. In the water industry, it's been more in the 25, 30% fixed charge, and then the rest variable, depending where you live.
Mm.
Are higher.
Yeah,
And
that could vary quite a bit.
vary quite a bit because every city sets their own rates and things. And uh, the reality is the water industry, the bills would be a little more static and probably be a politically better if we had a greater percentage of fixed charges in there. That would help, and it does create some of that usage, the conservation side effect where we do have that awkward message in the water industry where people do a great job in drought, and we say thank you for conserving water. And guess what? We're going to add 20% to your water bill because now we have less revenue coming in and we got to collect more money. So we got to charge you more to use. And that naturally is a frustrating message to people. You don't really have that in the electrical industry. But whether you call it decoupled or not, you're paying for it in the electrical world, you're paying for it in the water world. So there's a little bit of a myth in there, but I do think the water industry would benefit from a greater ratio of fixed charges to at least get some of that mindset away that the more you conserve, the more you got to pay.
Yeah, I mean, the promise of decoupling in the abstract would be for, say, the utility to be made whole for efficiency and conservation targets, and where it's not directly on the ratepayers, for acting well. But that's the ideal, right? And in reality, it's not really been that way.
No, I mean, it is still on the ratepayers. They just pay for it under a different charge. But the ratepayers still pay their electrical rates. They still pay their water rates. It's not like the state came in and funded half the conservation. You still pay for it. It's just got a label on it. But I do think the water industry would benefit from that.
So you mentioned actually that was news to me about the say Colorado agreement, or at least the lower Colorado stakeholders. And by the way, there are the upper Colorado, state of Colorado, Utah, other states, right? There's 7 states involved, but
Mexico or the others.
Yeah. Oh, well, and all the tribes, but so there's no shortage of stakeholders, right? For the Colorado, right? 2 countries, 7 states, 20 tribal nations, all these federal agencies. It should be noted, though, actually, that pretty famously, the California's share of Colorado River water, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe it's something like 3/4 goes to Imperial irrigation, and the remainder goes to Metropolitan. And so
the 3/4 of California's share of the Colorado River is used for agriculture, most of it to Imperial Valley, and then some in Coachella and Palo Verde Valley. And then the remainder goes to Southern California for its 19 million people, so to Metropolitan.
And it should be noted too that the longtime head of Metropolitan has been advising Imperial irrigation. I mean, obviously, much was made of that, not quite Nixon in China or something, but just things along those lines. Obviously, Imperial's been I guess, a rival over the years, if you will, or historically.
Historically, Metropolitan and Imperial Valley have been like this. The two Imperial's the big water user on the river. Metropolitan's the big population base, and they've been like this. I ran Metropolitan for 15 years, and now I'm an advisor to Imperial Valley. And so there is an irony there, but I'm enjoying working with them. And the goal, of course, is to find a middle ground for the two agencies to collaboratively work through these issues.
Mhm. Um, uh, I just want to get to some of the other, oh, well, let me just outline just some of the things that are looking to ask you about. This is kind of like storms out in the Pacific. Uh, well, speaking of storms, so a number of these things on my list here. Uh, Floods, subsidence, Arc Storm 2.0, comments on your time with Pasadena, and also comments on the new Cal Water directorship. I see Ken Jenkins is on the call from Cal Water. Uh, but there is a residual question in Q&A about actually, I guess this is more about California Department of Water Resources addressed access between urban and agriculture given the differing levels of essential use and water value. So, I mean, I'm still surprised about the 10% ag makeup of water, but anyway, just any thoughts there, or kind of even, I guess, more statewide?
Yeah, statewide, obviously ag is bigger. I was talking about in metropolitan service area alone,
Mhm.
we have shrunk our agricultural usage. We still have some avocado farmers, but not much left. We've converted Southern California, for better or worse, into housing. But as a statewide, and generally as a ratio, you're finding 75 to 80% of the water that's used by people goes to agriculture, 15, 20% urban for the cities. And, while that's a big swing, the reality is people, if we're going to eat, the way you make food is water and sun, so that is the product that there is not agriculture absent those two basic, you need land, water, and sun, and you need a lot of them. You need a lot of all three of them to make food, and we all want to eat. So that is going to be the reality. Most of the water is going to be used by agriculture, and we in the urban sector are going to use our piece of it and use it as efficiently as possible. And that's happens across the state, and it happens across the Southwest, and it happens pretty much everywhere. And so California is no exception to that. But we also have this incredible agricultural sector and economy, and we grow very highly specialized crops in California that you can't grow anywhere in the world. California supplies about 90% of the world's pistachios. I mean, it's amazing. 75, 80% of the world's almonds, most of the world's walnuts. If you're eating a salad in Cleveland in the winter, it came from California. An artichoke anywhere in the United States, it came from California. So these are pretty important products, and keeps everyone healthy. So we need to find a way to make sure we have sufficient water to feed the nation and provide food security, and provide for our population as well. So that's a tension that's always been there between the ag and the urban sectors. So that's going to continue to be that disconnect, that big disconnect. Most of the water goes to ag.
Actually, this is kind of a quicker question about how much power is generated by the state water project. And I would add, how is that compared with the energy used by the state water project?
Yeah, the state water project does generate a fair amount of power, particularly coming out of Oroville. We got the power plant there coming out of Oroville, so every time we do that, but also along stretches of the aqueduct, wherever we have a decent drop, there's power generation, and it generates hundreds of megawatts a year. But at the end of the day, it's still a net user. At one point, I think they measured just that lift going over the Tehachapi's at the Edmonston pumping plant to move the water over the Tehachapi Mountains to Southern California. That's after you've used the water for the Central Valley, the remainder that gets pumped into Southern California. It was the largest single point user of electricity in the entire state. At one point measured as using 6% of the entire state's electricity at one single spot. It's a much lesser percentage number, not because it uses less power, but because the state's overall energy use has grown. But it's still a huge user. So it does generate a fair amount of power, but at the end of the day, the project is still a net user. It doesn't cover its overall usage. But wherever we can, we use, in our business, we use gravity. So once we get the water into Southern California from the Colorado River and the State Water Project, there's only two spots, two little low spots, one in Orange County and one in Riverside, where we actually pump water. The entire all of Southern California, 5,000 square miles, is fed by gravity. You know, the treatment plants were all built in places like Riverside, which are about 1,200 feet above sea level. And then we use gravity to feed it all the way out to the coast. And it's it's an incredible engineering system and feat, much like, just copying what the Romans did with the aqueducts. Wherever we can, we use gravity, and we managed to use gravity to supply all of Southern California's water around the area once we bring it over the mountains.
Yeah, getting over the grapevine, I think, well, I haven't updated this, but I think it was like 6% of the energy in California was pumping water over the grapevine.
It's like 2% now, but it's the same idea. Still a huge.
A couple of comments. When you were talking about growing almonds and walnuts, and invariably there was a comment here about the 5 gallons to grow a walnut. How is it worth it? And I did check that 41 to 44 inches of water, or it works out to about 4.9 gallons per walnut is obviously a substantial use. I think almonds are about 2 gallons. And then then there was also a comment about decoupling, back to water decoupling. Decoupling together with balancing accounts and multi-year buffering can work for water customers, and I would certainly agree, in terms of the ideal, the way it's been prosecuted has not been anywhere, near that, but that would be certainly useful to do. I didn't mention this one question, which I was saving for last, but I will ask it now, and that was about curious about thoughts about groundwater extraction shifting the Earth's axis. And this references a Scientific American article about making Earth wobblier because of groundwater extraction. And actually it's in I'll copy this and put this in the chat for folks to look on their own, but very interesting question.
Well, I'll touch on those real quick for a couple of them. One, water usage for nuts, for their almonds and walnuts. Yes, the stat of it takes a gallon of water for a single almond looks on its face pretty startling. And I remember once checking the math and talking with some ag people and some other folks, and yeah, it's actually pretty much spot on. That's about right. And the same with walnuts being more gallons, like a few gallons for a single walnut. The water usage isn't in, of course, the actual nut itself. It's in the tree. Most of that water is in the tree and a little bit's in the nut itself. And you got a tree that's going to produce the product, the nuts, for 20 some years. And what you're doing is growing that tree from a sapling, of a couple feet tall to this huge flowering tree that provides that food source for decades. And it's a protein, and it's a portable protein that's high in human health value. So everything is a trade-off, but it does provide a lot of protein. It provides a lot of value, and there's only a few places in the world you can grow these crops. One of the intriguing things is you can really only grow these things in the Mediterranean climates and the temperate zones in the world. And there's really only 5 Mediterranean true climates in the world. It's the Mediterranean, it's California, South Africa, Chile, and Australia. And that's home to all these things that, we like to eat. And not a lot of other places, you just really can't grow them. You can grow wheats and corns and other things, but you can't really grow the nuts and the wine grapes and all those specialty type products. So we really have to think about how we manage those in a global world. Um, the decoupled, the balancing accounts, all that's true. I think it would make for a better structured system in how we pay for water. At the end of the day, the water is still going to cost the same. I think it's actually going to cost about the same per unit. You're going to have different labels on how you pay for it. You're going to stabilize your billing a little better. You're going to have less volatility in your rate structure. All those are good things in terms of economics of managing. We've seen it in energy. It's still going to cost the same. Energy costs more than water. Why? Because it's more expensive, regardless of how we've structured it and what we say you're paying for. The water is going to cost less, but it will be better managed if we did those things. A big reason why we haven't gone to those is we passed a lot of complicated laws in California. We started with Prop 13, and then we added Prop 218, and we've added Prop 26. And there's incredible legal hurdles you have to jump through in terms of water and what you can charge for, how you can't, what labels you can put on fixed charges, not fixed charges, what you can put on property tax. We've just made it an incredibly legalistically complicated world. So yes, if you could wave a magic wand or get the legislature to restructure how we pay for things, I think it would be better and more stable and better for the consumer. At the end of the day, your water bill would still be about the same, I think, more or less. And then you had a last point in there.
Well, yeah,
world
well, I'm sorry, go ahead.
yeah, fascinating stuff about subsidence and overpumping and some of the impacts that we've seen in terms of that you can see from outer space, some of the subsidence, some of the issues that in measurement, injection of fracking and other things we've seen causing earthquakes, causing changes in the Earth's orbit, by minute amounts that you can now sort of measure that you couldn't used to. Good news is most of the United States now regulates groundwater pumping. California was the latecomer. We're progressive in a lot of ways in California, but we were the last state to really embrace government regulation of groundwater pumping. We truly had the Wild West. People pumped whatever they could drill to. We now are slowly getting in the age of regulation of groundwater to make it sustainable and keep it and bring it into balance. But we've been the laggard in this regard. So something that's going to be better, that we need to get better at, and we're seeing it around the world. People are realizing you have to be sustainable in how you're pumping. You can't just pump and drain the system and then have nothing left for next generations.
It's kind of funny you mentioned the magic wand, and this was actually that's something of an institutional thing from our first wet talk about the magic wand question, and this was Felicia Marcus with the magic wand as well. So we immortalized it there, and that is one question. Well, there's two that I'll let you finish out with, and the time has gone quickly as I promised. Well, one is just Metropolitan is obviously a wholesale water provider and kind of regional planner, and then you've had some experience with Pasadena and a retailer, and as well as now with Cal Water. And so so that's a kind of a question as far as contrasting that overall wholesaler provider versus more of the retail situations. And then I wondered also about just subsidence within the metropolitan infrastructure. Was there was pipelines affected and everything in terms of subsidence over the years? I mean, obviously in the Central Valley, there's been quite a lot of impacts on infrastructure.
So the couple of points you made there. Yeah. So when I retired from Metropolitan after a career there of 25 years, I took some time off and, did all the fun things and backpacking and traveling and stuff. But then I lived in Pasadena. I was living in Pasadena at the time, and a friend, Pasadena had lost their city manager and the head of their water and power department and some other folks coming out of COVID. And the interim city manager was a longtime friend, asked me if I would come in and be the interim head of water and power for a year. So I did that, hired my replacement, hired a new head of water, helped them do some of their planning changes, and, helped them out for a year. And it was a good experience moving to retail from wholesale. I would get calls on Sunday afternoon from the wife of the mayor saying, she'd spotted some water running down the street, in fact, the former mayor, and could we get out and do something about it? And I was going, boy, I never got a phone call like that at Metropolitan, 19 million people, but no one knew who we were. You're very visible when you're the head of water and power of 150,000 residents. Like I said, any of the council members or their wives would pick up the phone and call you and say, what about this? I enjoyed it. It was a good experience, and it really gave me a lot of feel for how the retail and the responsiveness to the customer you have to be. So that was a pretty good experience. It was a unique one, but it was for 1 year, and I'm glad I did that. Working now with Cal Water on the private side of doing things. I've always been on the public side.
Yeah.
Now this is a private sector. Same challenges, same problems, but also looking at it from a financing perspective, working through the CPUC, getting the rates approved by a state organization instead of approving your own rates, instead of improving your own projects necessarily. A whole different regulatory hurdle that is new to me and fascinating. And so I've enjoyed my brief time. I've only been there a couple months, but I've enjoyed being on their board and wrestling with the kind of projects that they have to deal with. Many of them are the same, and yet they've also got their own nuances and different challenges. And I'm finding that enjoyable to, learn something new.
Yeah, one of the intriguing things with Cal Water in some, not all, but some of their regions, I think specifically like South San Francisco and maybe San Mateo, is this idea of net zero water and the impact and development at the CEQA level as far as new projects and their impact on existing water supply. And I don't know if you've gotten into that at all, but it's a very interesting concept.
And one of the things that feels very much at home, one of the great benefits Metropolitan brings to Southern California is that economy of scale. When we're acting on behalf of 19 million people, we can hire, a best in the class limnologist to really study our reservoir system, a best in class water quality lab to test everything, because we're leveraging 19 million ratepayers and providing for them, and can build infrastructure and really have that specialized workforce. In many respects, what I'm seeing in Cal Water is doing that at a localized level. When you're representing agencies throughout California, but also in other jurisdictions, Nevada and Texas and Hawaii and other states, you can bring that specialized workforce and that real best-in-class thinking, because you can spread it around areas and bring an economy of scale that a small community in the Southern Bay Area would not be able to afford on its own with maybe 100,000, 50,000 ratepayers managing it. But when you're leveraging that economy of scale, that's what Cal Water is doing. They're just not doing it in a geographically contiguous way that Metropolitan did. So that brings different challenges. But in our modern world where we can communicate so much better and it's much more seamless, distance has become, less of a challenge. And so it's finding using technology and economies of scale to benefit consumers. It's very smart.
Well, Jeff Kightlinger, thank you for coming on this wet talk. It's been fair. Well, speaking of geography, a lot of ground covered. But thank you once again.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me, Dennis. Enjoyed it.